Picture yourself at 18, wrapped in a flame-colored bridal veil, believing you're heading toward a night of joy. Instead, you're guided into a chamber packed with unfamiliar faces, servants, observers, and a quiet doctor standing by. They told you this was custom. Nobody mentioned you'd be inspected. Nobody warned you your body would be recorded. And certainly nobody explained the wooden object lurking in the corner under heavy fabric, an object whose purpose everyone else in that room already understood. Within moments, you'll grasp why that covering exists. Within moments, you'll comprehend why your mother wept while braiding your hair earlier. And within moments, you'll discover your wedding night has nothing to do with romance. It's about proof. This isn't make-believe. This was matrimony in ancient Rome. A ceremony so troubling that Roman chroniclers refused to spell it out, and early followers of Christ worked to erase it from history completely. Once that fabric gets pulled back, Livia will learn what lies behind the ritual Rome prayed the world would forget, and so will you. The year was 89 CE. The emperor commanded Rome with absolute power, and 18-year-old Livia Tursa was moments away from discovering that Roman matrimony wore two masks, the visible one saffron veils, thrown walnuts, happy melodies, and the concealed one, performed behind locked doors before people who might someday testify to every detail in a courtroom. What awaited her was a ceremony so uncomfortable that ancient Roman writers dodged, describing it plainly, one that Christian authors later tried desperately to purge from collective memory. Before we dive deeper into this account, if you're drawn to history's buried nightmares, hit subscribe on Grim History and smash that like button. And when you hit the part that disturbs you most, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Let's get started. Before this evening, before the observers and the fabric-draped object, the day had started beautifully. Her wedding parade had felt almost magical. Livia donned the customary flame-colored veil, the flammeum, identifying her unmistakably as a new bride. Her hair had been styled before sunrise, divided with a spear point, and braided into 6 sections tied with wool ribbons. Every element honored strict traditional customs. At the temple, the offering proceeded without incident. The holy man had interpreted good signs from the sheep's shining organs. Her father had spoken the age-old words, transferring her from his legal guardianship to her husband's, and she'd repeated the phrases countless brides had murmured before her. Ubi tu Gaius. Ego Gaia, where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. A pledge declaring she no longer possessed herself. Her new husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a prosperous grain trader 25 years her senior, had encountered her just 3 times before that day. Still, according to law, the ceremony had already bound her to him. Or rather, it had initiated the process, because in Rome, the public ritual was merely the opening act. The genuinely binding moment lurked at the conclusion of the torch-illuminated march through the city, inside a dwelling she'd never stepped foot in, encircled by people she hadn't consented to face. The masses lining the roads had chanted the traditional Fescennine verses, vulgar, explicit, purposefully mortifying, designed to entertain the gods and ward off malevolent spirits. Young men hollered suggestions through the veil that made Livia's cheeks burn with shame. Her mother had insisted the songs were innocent, meant to shield her, but Livia had noticed her mother's shaking fingers while arranging her hair that morning. She'd seen the tears her mother attempted to conceal, and she recalled the final caution whispered in her ear. Don't fight back. Whatever they demand, don't resist. It only makes things worse. When they arrived at the residence of Marcus Petronius Rufus, the final streaks of daylight had disappeared. The entrance had been adorned with garlands of greenery and wool, 2 blazing torches identifying it as a location where a marriage would be consummated per ancestral tradition. The singing crowd grew more boisterous. Someone hurled walnuts at her as a fertility charm, the shells catching in her dress folds and scratching her skin. It felt more like mockery than blessing. Marcus stood in the doorway, and beyond him, Livia could detect movement, far too many shadows, way more people than anticipated. Custom demanded that her husband carry her across the threshold to prevent the bad omen of tripping. But the gesture ran deeper than that. It recalled an era when brides didn't enter their husbands' homes by choice at all. Once the door closed behind her, muffling the songs outside, Livia finally glimpsed who'd been waiting in the entrance hall. An aged woman in ritual garments, the pronuba, whose responsibility was overseeing every moment of the evening. A priest of ambiguous affiliation. 3 female servants holding bowls and linens. An older gentleman with a leather satchel containing medical tools. And in the corner, partially concealed beneath draped linen, a wooden structure almost 4 feet in height. The pronuba approached and gripped Livia's hands, her hold strong enough to stop any escape attempt. "Welcome to your husband's dwelling," she announced. "The sacred rites must now be fulfilled." Few people talk honestly about what Roman marriage actually was. It wasn't romantic, wasn't sentimental, wasn't a celebration of 2 hearts. It was a business deal, a legal handover of power witnessed and recorded as meticulously as the purchase of farmland or animals. Under the most ancient Roman statutes, a wife transferred completely into her husband's dominion, placed in manu, literally in his grip. He wielded the same legal authority over her that he held over his servants, even the theoretical power to decide life and death. By the early imperial period, when Livia crossed that threshold, the laws had mellowed on the surface. Women could possess property, separation was achievable, certain aspects of paternal control had shifted. But the bedrock stayed the same. Marriage moved a woman from one man's legal grasp to another's, and like all significant transfers in Rome, this one demanded confirmation. Consider how Romans managed land transactions. Observers watched, ceremonies invoked divine sanction, boundaries got inspected and walked, papers were stamped, nothing got assumed. Everything got verified. Romans used the same reasoning for marriage with one dark difference. The property being handed over was a living, breathing body, and that body's capacity to create lawful heirs was the commodity being acquired. Therefore, Roman law demanded both the bride's purity and the completion of the marriage be verified before the union counted as finalized, not gossiped about, not presumed, verified. And the ceremonies created to accomplish that verification, the ones Livia was about to confront, were ones that precious few ancient authors risked describing openly, because even in Rome they were deemed unspeakably private. Livia stood shaking beside the shrouded wooden object, unaware that what happened next would sear itself into her memory forever. A ceremony so disturbing that future generations would desperately try to act like it never happened. Roman law was disturbingly explicit on one matter. A marriage didn't exist legally or socially until the union was physically finalized. And it wasn't sufficient for husband and wife to merely claim it had occurred. There needed to be confirmation, observation, and sworn statements. Without observers, the entire marriage could face challenge. Without proof of the bride's virginity, the lawfulness of future offspring could get questioned. For Rome, that ambiguity was intolerable. So Romans invented rituals that matched perfectly with their legal perspective and feel shockingly unthinkable to ours. The pronuba tightened her grasp on Livia's arm and steered her toward the veiled structure in the corner. Livia's heart pounded so violently she could sense its beat in her throat. She knew that whatever stood under that cloth would transform everything about her existence, her body, her understanding. But there was no turning back now. "You must acknowledge Mutinus Tutinus," the pronuba whispered, her voice calm, but her grip unyielding. "You must request his blessing before your husband may come near. The gods must observe your surrender." Livia gulped hard, her breathing unsteady. She'd never encountered this deity before and had zero idea what acknowledging him truly involved. Her hands trembled as she reached for the draped material. The observers leaned in closer. Even the servants froze. The entire chamber seemed to stop breathing. When Livia removed the cloth, she grasped why. Standing beneath the covering was a wooden figure carved with disturbing anatomical precision into the form of a phallic idol. But it wasn't a tiny talisman like the charms children wore for protection. It wasn't a rough scare figure positioned in gardens to frighten away trespassers. It was intentional, carefully proportioned, constructed for one function, and that function became horrifyingly obvious the instant the pronuba started to explain. Mutinus Tutinus was Rome's obscure god of initiation and fertility. Ancient writers mention him only in passing and always with a hint of discomfort, as though the very name felt improper. Augustine, writing centuries afterward, as Christianity strengthened its hold on Rome, described the ritual with rage and revulsion. Roman brides were obligated to sit upon the god's representation before lying with their spouses, and they did this before observers. He condemned the practice, but he didn't fabricate it. Other early Christian scholars referenced the same rite, suggesting it was too disgraceful to describe openly. Arnobius insisted brides were forced to straddle the symbol while their new husbands looked on. Lactantius maintained that speaking of it contaminated the tongue. Even Varro, a pagan scholar centuries prior, mentioned brides being presented to Mutinus Tutinus with language that implied physical contact, though he deliberately avoided specifics. Modern scholars, uncomfortable with the implications, often minimized the descriptions, proposing perhaps brides only sat gently on the statue's lap in some symbolic act. But the ancient wording doesn't support this gentler reading. Augustine employed insedere, a term meaning to settle onto, to mount. Arnobius's language hinted at penetration. Lactantius declined to describe the details whatsoever, something improbable if the act had been just a symbolic touch. The official reasoning, naturally, was fertility. The unspoken motive might have been something different: to break down opposition, to showcase submission before observers, to prepare a virgin bride for what the law demanded next. Livia stood paralyzed before the wooden god, the wavering lamplight casting its grotesque shadow across the wall. The pronuba moved behind her, adjusting her stance, positioning her body, directing her without tenderness. The observers watched in complete silence. Her husband watched. The physician waited behind them, hands folded, ready for what followed. And in that instant, Livia finally grasped the significance of her mother's quivering warning, the crude street songs, the secrecy, the terror. She understood what being a Roman wife would genuinely require. Technically, she could say no, but refusal meant the marriage agreement would crumble. She'd return to her father's household not as an honorable bride, but as a rejected woman, tainted, untouchable, unmarriageable. She'd disgrace her family. She'd become a source of whispered scandal at dinner gatherings. Her life, as she recognized it, would end, so she didn't refuse. When the ritual concluded, servants came forward with heated, perfumed water. They cleaned her carefully, chanting prayers intended to purify her after her encounter with the god. But the washing had a second objective, a more practical one. It readied her for the inspection. The physician, who'd been observing silently, now advanced, and Livia felt her stomach plummet. This segment was also mandatory. In marriages involving wealth, bloodline, or political standing, Roman brides underwent medical verification before the ceremony. A midwife or doctor documented the bride's virginity. The records of that inspection could later settle disputes about inheritance or legitimacy. The texts preserved by Roman medical authorities, brutal in their exactness, leave zero doubt about what the inspection entailed. That first inspection, conducted earlier, established the baseline. It declared Livia untouched and asset unaltered, as Roman law viewed it. Now arrived the second inspection. This one verified that the ritual with Mutinus Tutinus had been executed, that the physical evidence matched earlier documentation, that she was, according to Roman thinking, prepared. Everything happened with the observers present. Their declarations could later be required in court if the marriage ever got challenged, and not a single person in that chamber seemed to experience the slightest unease about what was being inflicted on her. Modern audiences recoil at these accounts. What feels invasive, degrading, and traumatic to us was to Romans simply standard legal procedure. The bride's comfort didn't enter the calculation. Her feelings were as meaningless as the emotions of a field being surveyed before purchase. Property didn't possess feelings. Property got transferred, and the procedures needed to be honored. When the inspection finally ended, the pronuba guided Livia toward the bedchamber prepared for the consummation. The room was set up exactly as tradition dictated. The bed was situated so it could be readily viewed from the entrance, because that entrance, by custom, would stay open throughout the night. Oil lamps burned steadily, providing enough illumination for the pronuba to watch without interruption. Servants lingered nearby to help afterward. Every aspect of the room felt staged, organized, prepared for a ritual Livia couldn't avoid. Marcus entered finally. He paused at the entrance, glanced at the watching Pronuba, and stepped toward the bed. His expression betrayed something Livia hadn't expected. Not confidence, not passion, but discomfort. As though even he recognized that what was about to unfold wasn't an act of closeness. It was an act of verification. And the night was just beginning. Marcus hesitated at the doorway, and that alone shocked Livia. She'd anticipated a man who was confident, certain, even commanding someone who knew precisely what this night required. Instead, he looked quickly toward the Pronuba, as if wanting approval or authorization, a faint blush of embarrassment crossing his features before he neared the bed. The Pronuba raised her chin, her voice ceremonial, and waited with ritual authority. The bride is made ready. The gods have observed her surrender. Let the union be fulfilled according to the ways of our forefathers. Let those present confirm the act. Let no question remain that this woman has become a wife. Her tone permitted no hesitation. What followed unfolded gradually, hour after hour, under the unwavering gaze of those assigned to observe. The Pronuba maintained watch from the entrance, stepping forward only when tradition required guidance, occasionally adjusting something, occasionally correcting Livia's position or Marcus's approach, ensuring that every piece of the consummation matched legal expectation. The door remained open. Lamplight poured into the hallway. Anyone in the household could hear the movements, the voices, the ritual instructions. Every sound was part of the documentation, part of the proof. Nothing about that night was intimate. Nothing was supposed to be. For Livia, the bed linens might as well have been documents, and her body the ink Rome required to seal the contract. Everything that transpired was a form of verification, one final step to make the transfer of authority unquestionable. By sunrise, the atmosphere felt thick, the lamps burned dim, and the physician returned. He stepped inside with the same clinical detachment he'd displayed earlier. His assignment was straightforward. Confirm that consummation had taken place, and that Livia now carried the physical marks expected of a woman who'd crossed from virgin to wife. His inspection was documented. The Pronuba provided her sworn declaration. Observers nodded in agreement. The legal transformation was finished. Livia Tersa, barely 18, was now officially a Roman wife. Her role, her identity, her destiny had all been reshaped within a single evening. She would continue to bear children over the following decade. She would manage her husband's estate, host gatherings, supervise servants, conduct religious obligations, and carry herself with the dignity expected of a matron. To the outside world, she would seem dignified, competent, respectable. But regarding her wedding night, she would speak to nobody, not even her own daughters. There were no words for it. And truthfully, she'd never heard another woman discuss theirs either. Livia's silence wasn't unusual. It was universal. Women of her society didn't record these experiences. Men didn't chronicle them in personal detail. The rituals were so thoroughly woven into the fabric of marital life that describing them would have seemed pointless, like explaining sunlight or breathing. Everyone already knew, and yet nobody spoke. That's why historians today struggle to piece together what genuinely happened behind closed doors in ancient homes. Much of what we understand comes from fragments, angry condemnations by Christian authors, scraps of legal commentary, casual mentions in medical texts, and archaeological clues whose significance becomes apparent only when positioned beside these scattered writings. The lack of detailed records isn't proof of conspiracy, it's proof of familiarity. The rituals were the water Roman women swam in, so omnipresent that describing them felt unnecessary. For nearly a millennium, this was marriage in Rome. Generations of brides walked the same torch-illuminated paths. Generations of mothers whispered the same cautions. Generations of young women suffered the same night, the same observers, the same scrutiny. The system persisted because everyone, men, women, families, priests, accepted its reasoning. Property needed to be verified. Legal transfers required observers. Marriage produced lawful heirs and therefore needed evidence. Women were the channel through which family bloodlines continued. It made sense within its own framework. even as it feels monstrous to us. The conclusion of these practices didn't arrive from Rome deciding it had crossed a line. It arrived from the outside, from the expansion of Christianity and the shift in Roman values during the 4th and 5th centuries. With new theology came new beliefs. If women possessed souls equal to men's, they couldn't be handled merely as property. If marriage was a holy sacrament, it couldn't include rituals the Church considered obscene. If modesty was a virtue, the presence of observers during consummation became unbearable. The transformation wasn't immediate, it wasn't simple, it wasn't total, but slowly, across cities and elite homes, the old ceremonies were discarded or transformed beyond recognition. And with them disappeared the evidence. Statues of Mutinus Tutinus were destroyed or buried. Texts mentioning the wedding night rituals were quietly pulled from libraries or allowed to deteriorate. Wall paintings hinting at the rites were covered over. The pronuba's duty contracted from active supervisor to symbolic attendant. Within several generations, the complete knowledge of what Roman weddings had once demanded vanished, recalled only faintly in obscure manuscripts studied by curious scholars centuries later. The Christians who rebuilt Rome weren't merely erasing embarrassing details. They were constructing a new civilization atop the wreckage of the old, while refusing to admit what those ruins had once supported. They succeeded almost entirely. Today, most people picture Roman marriage as saffron veils, festive songs, and scattered walnuts, a charming mix of ritual and romance. But fragments remain. Fragments always remain. Livia died around 31 CE, approximately 60 years old. She'd been a wife for over 4 decades. She'd raised children. She'd met every expectation placed on her. But what did she remember when she thought about her wedding night? Did she relive the fear, the humiliation, the helplessness? Did she find peace with it over time? Did she wish her daughters would face something gentler? Or did she accept it as unchangeable, simply the way things were? We can't know. She left no written account. Roman women of her class weren't expected to. The silence surrounding these rituals comes from women whose experiences were never deemed important enough to preserve, whose bodies were central to legal systems, yet whose thoughts were insignificant to the histories men documented. We know what was inflicted upon them. We rarely know what they felt. Still, we know enough to grasp why generations tried so desperately to erase this aspect of Roman existence. Rome is often celebrated as the foundation of Western law, order, and civilization. But recognizing what Rome demanded of its women complicates that narrative. It reveals to us that brutality and sophistication can exist side by side, that legal advancement can function alongside systematic dehumanization. The rituals are gone, but the women who endured them were real. For Livia, for her mother, for her daughters, for countless unnamed brides whose wedding nights were rituals of control, scrutiny, and verification, they lived. They endured. And they were silenced.